Hello everyone, today I'm going to give you some tips and suggestions on how to build your VBC Racing TBB shocks. Now, we have two shocks here. We have one shock with no hole in the shock cap and this shock here with a hole in the shock cap. I'm going to explain later my preferred choice and my experiences running both of them. I did a shakedown last week and I'll give you a little bit of insight of how the car handles with each type of shock. Okay. However, the assembly between the two shocks are basically the same. There might be a slight variance where you might want to add or take away some oil depending on how much rebound you want to get using the shock with the no hole in the shock cap. Okay. Now, when it comes to some tips and suggestions, I want to let you guys know that when it comes to the piston, when it's mounted to the actual shock shaft, ideally you want to glue the piston onto the shock shaft. This just eliminates any slop that the piston might generate over time, and it creates a nice, consistent dampening action. Okay. Now moving over to the cartridge assembly here, we have a O-ring inside and also this plastic guide which keeps the shaft in alignment with the shock. Okay. Now I like to use the Yokomo blue O-ring. That's you can go ahead and use the white O-ring by VBC Racing, but I prefer the blue O-ring. It tends to create a better seal. And I also use O-ring grease by Axion Racing, which works really well. Now, before you even tighten down this assembly right here, you want to make sure that the shock piston is moving freely throughout the whole shock stroke, because if there's any binding, that's going to affect the overall dampening performance. So if you do have an issue where once this is tightened down, it starts binding, what is happening is the shock shaft is not in alignment with the actual plastic guide shaft here. Okay, this guide here. You want to loosen up the cap a bit and just kind of, in a gentle circular motion, just kind of like rock it around a bit, just to kind of get everything seated and in line with each other. And then once you've achieved that, tighten it down, check again. If it's not, you might want to do it again. And if there's an issue, then you might need to take a look at the actual plastic itself, okay? Once that's completed and you're happy with how smooth it is, then you are going to add oil to the shock body. Pretty simple. Add oil, get the bubbles out, you're good to go. Next, you want to get your oil sealer cap, whatever color that you choose. I suggest using the kit black oil sealer cap. Now, as you can see here, I've pushed the shock shaft all the way up. All right. Now, if you can visualize that the shock is full of oil right now, I'm going to place the oil sealer cap on. Now, there is some instances where the oil sealer cap will touch, will touch the piston, okay? Now, that's perfectly fine. What you can do is simply use your finger and press in the middle of the oil sealer cap and let go of the bottom of the shock shaft, okay? And then once you've done that and the oil sealer cap is seated or sealed on the actual shock body itself, then you can take your plastic component here and your threaded aluminum portion. Now, what I like to do is I like to put this plastic piece on top of the oil sealer cap first, and then I apply some slight pressure onto the oil sealer cap. And then, while my finger is still pushing down on the oil sealer cap, I thread the top of the shock collar down all the way. And that's pretty much it. And then what you want to do is check to see if the shock is operating smoothly. And you want to make sure that the rebound is the same for all shocks. Now, when it comes to the shock with a hole in the shock cap, it doesn't really matter how much rebound you have. Like it can't be like a huge discrepancy between the two, but generally you want to make sure that each shock is built the same way, and there might be a little bit of rebound with the shock, but that's not a huge issue whatsoever. As long as there's not like a huge variance between the shocks, you want to make sure that each shock is relatively consistent between each other, okay? Now, when it comes to which shock I prefer, I definitely prefer using the shock with the hole in the shock cap. The car is a lot easier to drive. The car doesn't like list in the corners. I found during some tight sections in the infields of Yacht Bay Arena, the actual car, when using this damper setup, the car would kind of like really roll onto itself. And it didn't, the car didn't traction roll, but it was noticeable. And when you see that, you think, oh, it's gonna traction roll, and it just makes you kind of let go of the throttle a little bit. I personally prefer the shock with the hole in the shock cap because the car stays flat in the corner regardless of where you are on the track. It barely lifts or moves. It stays to the track, and it keeps the car consistent and flat throughout all of the corners. So when it comes down to it, I think this is the shock to go for, the one with the shock hole in the cap. Now, how big of a shock hole should you put in the cap? You'll have to test that. There's guys that run, 1 millimeter holes, 1.5, 2 millimeter holes. It really depends on what drill bit you have in your toolbox. I don't think there's going to be a big difference between how big the hole size is in the shock hole cap. As long as the air is able to escape, then you're perfectly fine. But if I was to suggest a drill size, maybe 1.5 millimeter is a good starting point. And I've just used that throughout your time with racing with holes in your shock caps. But I don't particularly like using the shocks with no hole in the cap. I just found that the car wasn't as consistent. And you can visually see the car, rolling side to side on its suspension. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, bye-bye.